The courtroom was silent when the doors opened, and the sound of heavy boots echoed across the wooden floor. A young black woman in a wrinkled Marine uniform was led inside in chains as if she were a criminal. Her name was Naomi Carter, and she was only 30 years old. Yet her chest carried the ribbons of wars most people had only seen on TV. The guards treated her like she was dangerous, but her eyes were calm and proud. The eyes of someone who had fought for a country that now looked at her with suspicion. The older people in the room whispered to one another, and a child tugged at his mother's sleeve, asked why a soldier was in handcuffs. The mother had no answer. The judge sat high above, looking down with a hard face, but the truth was that Naomi had not broken any law. She had only spoken up against a white officer who insulted her because of her skin. That moment of courage was twisted into a charge of assault. It was as if her years of service meant nothing the second she refused to bow her head. Naomi thought of her father, who had told her as a child that in America, sometimes the uniform would not protect her. She thought of her mother, who had prayed for her safety every night while she was overseas, and she thought of the flag she had saluted so many times while believing that one day it would finally salute her back. The courtroom was waiting for her to fall apart. But Naomi stood taller, even with the chains around her wrists. Nobody knew that before this trial was over. A general would rise to his feet and give her the salute of honor that would silence every voice of hate in that room. Naomi Carter had grown up in a small town in Georgia where the streets were cracked and the houses leaned tired against the weight of time. Her father Samuel worked long hours at the mill, and her mother Ruth sang in the church choir on Sundays. Life was not easy, but Naomi was raised to stand tall and speak truth even when her voice shook. As a child, she would sit on the porch and listen to her grandfather tell stories about the Buffalo Soldiers who fought bravely even when their own country did not respect them. Those stories planted a fire inside her heart. By the time she turned 18, she knew she wanted to wear the uniform, not for the medals or the money, but to prove that courage had no color. Boot camp was harsh. Some of the instructors pushed her harder than the others, and she could hear the whispers about how she did not belong. Yet every time her body ached, she thought of her grandfather's voice saying, "Never let them break you." She became one of the top in her class and earned respect even from those who doubted her. On the battlefield, she saved lives without asking who those lives belonged to. She dragged wounded men out of burning vehicles and shielded others with her own body when bullets cut the air like knives. For Naomi, the Marine Code of Honor was not just words on paper. It was the way she lived. But she had also learned that some battles were not fought with guns. Some battles began when she returned home to the streets where people still looked at her skin before they looked at her heart. The night of her arrest began like any other ordinary evening. Naomi had gone to a small diner near the base, still wearing her uniform. She only wanted a hot meal after a long day of training new recruits. The place was crowded with locals, some in work boots and others in press shirts. And the TV in the corner played the evening news. Naomi took a seat near the back and ordered fried chicken with mashed potatoes. She felt the tired weight in her bones, but also a quiet pride that came from knowing she had given her best that day. Then a tall white officer named Lieutenant Briggs walked in with two friends. He was loud and carried himself like he owned the place. When he saw Naomi, he smirked and said too loudly for the room to ignore, "Look at that. They let anyone wear the uniform now." His friends laughed, but the laughter cut sharp against Naomi's skin. She tried to stay calm and focus on her food, but the officer came closer and leaned over her table. He said, "You should be serving tables, not serving this country." That was when Naomi looked him in the eye and said with a steady voice, "I serve with honor." "Do you?" The diner went silent. Briggs flushed red and slammed his hand on the table. Later, he would twist the story and claim she struck him, but the truth was she had only spoken. Still within hours, police came to her door. The same hands that once held medals were now forced into cold steel cuffs. As the neighbors watched from behind curtains, Naomi was dragged away under flashing lights for a crime she never committed. The jail cell was cold and smelled of rust and old sweat. Naomi sat on the hard bench with her back straight, refusing to let the walls close in on her spirit. The guard who had brought her in muttered something under his breath about troublemakers, but she kept her eyes forward. Hours passed slow as dripping water, and each sound of a closing door echoed like a hammer on stone. She thought of her Marines, who might be wondering why their sergeant had not returned. She thought of her parents, who would surely see the news before she could call them. Naomi whispered a prayer into the silence, asking for strength, not just for herself, but for every young black girl who might one day walk this same road. In the next cell, a woman stared at her and asked what she did. Naomi answered quietly, "I spoke the truth." The woman shook her head and said, "That is always the hardest crime in this town." Naomi did not cry, though her heart felt heavy. Instead, she remembered standing on foreign soil with explosions all around her and telling her men, "We will go home together." If she could survive that night, she could survive this cell. What cut deeper than the bars was knowing that the very flag she had saluted on battlefields now waved outside the jail as if mocking her. Still, she refused to bow her head. She promised herself that when the sun rose, she would walk into the courtroom, not as a prisoner, but as a Marine who still carried her honor, even in chains. The first day in court was a storm waiting to break. The room was packed with reporters holding cameras like weapons and townsfolk who had come to see the drama. Naomi was led inside with her wrists cuffed, but her chin lifted high. The judge, a gay-haired man named Judge Whitmore, peered down at her over his glasses with a cold expression. On one side sat Lieutenant Briggs, dressed neatly in his uniform with bandages on his hand, as if she had truly struck him. His friend sat behind him, ready to nod along to whatever story he told. Naomi's lawyer was a young black woman named Dana Brooks, who had graduated top of her class, but had never faced a case this heavy. Dana whispered, "You just keep standing strong and let me fight the rest." The prosecutor painted Naomi as a violent soldier who had no respect for authority. He said she lashed out when corrected and tried to turn the court against her character. But Dana rose and said, "Clearly this woman has bled for this country. She has medals for bravery that hang on her chest, not for decoration, but because she saved lives. Are we to believe that such a woman would throw it all away over a single insult?" The jury listened with tight faces. Some nodded, some looked doubtful. Naomi spoke only when asked, and her words were steady like stone. "I did not attack him. I only defended my dignity with my voice." The truth felt heavy in the air, but Naomi knew this trial was not just about her. It was about whether the truth could still matter in a world where lies were uniforms too. As the trial moved forward, the weight of the town seemed to press harder against Naomi's shoulders. Each day, the prosecutor brought witnesses who twisted the truth like bent wire. Briggs's two friends swore they saw Naomi strike him, though every word they spoke trembled with rehearsed lies. The judge listened without showing much emotion, but Naomi could feel the tide pulling against her. Reporters scribbled notes painting her as a soldier who snapped under pressure. At night in her cell, she could hear the guards talking about how the case would ruin her career. Still, she prayed each evening, asking God to let light cut through the dark. The Marines she had trained sent letters, but most were blocked before they reached her hands. One note did make it through, smuggled by a kind clerk. It said, "Sergeant Carter, we believe in you. Hold the line." Those words made her grip her hands tight and whisper back to herself, "I will hold." Yet, she also felt the sting of betrayal because the very corps she had served with such loyalty had remained silent in public. Higher officers wanted the scandal to pass without their names tied to it. Naomi realized that sometimes silence was the loudest wound of all. The fourth day of the trial brought her parents into town. Samuel Carter walked with a limp from years at the mill, and Ruth held his arm tightly as they entered the courtroom. Their faces were lined with both worry and pride. When Naomi saw them, her chest ached with both shame and relief. She wanted to run to them, but the cuffs on her wrists reminded her of where she stood. Ruth's eyes filled with tears, but she lifted her chin to show strength for her daughter. Samuel looked straight at the judge, and then at Briggs with a stare that carried decades of quiet endurance. During a break, Ruth leaned close to Naomi and whispered, "Baby, you were born for storms." Remember who you are, Samuel added softly. They can lock your hands, but not your soul. Those words sank into Naomi like steel, giving her the courage to face the next witness. The prosecutor sneered and tried to break her with questions, but Naomi answered steady and clear. The crowd in the back began to shift uneasily, as if they sensed the cracks in the story told against her. And while the trial was still heavy with doubt, Naomi felt her parents' presence like armor around her heart. She knew she was not standing alone. On the 5th day of trial, the prosecutor called a new witness no one had expected. It was an older man named Harold Pike, who owned the diner where the argument had happened. He shuffled to the stand with a nervous look, glancing quickly at Briggs before speaking. The prosecutor smiled wide, certain this man would seal the case. Harold began by saying he had run the diner for 30 years and respected all officers of the law. He claimed Naomi had raised her voice and scared the customers. Briggs sat straighter as if victory was already in his pocket. But then Dana stood and asked calmly, "Mr. Pike, do you remember if your security cameras were working that night?" The courtroom stirred. Harold stammered and said yes, but the tapes were lost. Dana pressed him again, lost or taken. Harold swallowed hard and looked down at his hands. For a long moment he said nothing, then finally whispered, "I was told to hand them over." The room gasped. The judge's gavel struck wood to quiet the crowd. Dana asked, "Who told you?" Harold's eyes flicked toward Briggs, but fear sealed his lips. Even so, the crack was wide enough now. The jury leaned forward, sensing that the truth was being hidden. Naomi felt her pulse quicken. It was the first time someone other than her had dared hint at the lie. That evening, Naomi sat in her cell, replaying Harold's trembling words. She knew he had not spoken the whole truth, but the spark was there. The next morning, Dana arrived with papers in her hands and fire in her eyes. She had filed a motion demanding the court release any military police records connected to Briggs. The judge looked annoyed but could not deny the request. Hours later, a clerk returned with a folder so thin it seemed almost empty. Yet inside was a report that stunned the room. It showed that Briggs had faced 2 prior complaints for harassment against female Marines, though both had been quietly buried. Dana held the paper high and said to the jury, "This is the man accusing Sergeant Carter, a man with a record of abuse, now claiming he was the victim." Briggs turned red and shouted lies across the courtroom, but the judge struck the gavel. The air in the room shifted. For the first time, Naomi saw some jurors look at her, not with suspicion, but with respect. It was a small step, yet it lit hope inside her chest like a candle in the dark. She whispered under her breath, "Thank you, Lord." The next day, the prosecutor called a witness Naomi had never expected to see against her. It was Corporal James Miller, one of the very Marines she had trained. He walked to the stand, avoiding her eyes. Naomi's chest tightened because she remembered how she had carried him out of a blast zone overseas' blood, soaking her uniform as she whispered, "You will not die today." Now he sat before the court, shifting nervously as the prosecutor asked him questions. To Naomi's shock, James claimed she had a temper during training and sometimes shouted too hard at recruits. He said she could be intimidating, and he would not be surprised if she snapped in public. Naomi felt the words like knives. She wanted to cry out, "James, you know me. You know the truth." But the judge's warning eyes kept her silent. Dana tried to cross-examine, pointing out that tough training saved lives on the battlefield, but the damage was done. The jury had seen a soldier she saved now casting shadows on her name. Naomi stared at James and saw shame flicker in his eyes. Yet, he did not take the words back. She realized fear of losing his own career had driven him to betray her. That betrayal hurt deeper than any chain on her wrists. That night, Naomi sat on the edge of her cot, feeling her spirit bend under the weight. She thought of the battlefield where she had shielded James with her body and wondered how loyalty could crumble so fast. Ruth came during visiting hours and held her hands through the glass, whispering, "Do not break Naomi. They want you to. That is why you cannot." Samuel pressed his palm against the glass and said, "They can smear your name, but they cannot erase your truth." Naomi nodded. "But inside the wound of betrayal, act sharp. Back in her cell, she prayed longer than ever before. She asked for strength to forgive, even as her heart screamed in pain. Then she remembered a lesson her grandfather once told her. Courage is not the absence of wounds. Courage is walking with them and still standing tall. Naomi wiped her tears and lifted her chin. Tomorrow would bring more lies and more storms, but she decided she would not let bitterness eat her alive. She whispered into the darkness. They may try to bury me, but I am a seed. News of the trial began spreading beyond the small town. Articles traveled through military circles and whispers reached the ears of General Marcus Harlan, a decorated leader known for his strict discipline, but also his fairness. He was in Washington when a young officer placed a file on his desk. Inside were clippings about Naomi Carter, the Marine sergeant now on trial for striking an officer. Harlan read the file slowly, his sharp eyes catching every detail. When he saw the list of medals Naomi had earned, he paused. Bronze Star Purple Heart commendations for saving entire squads. He frowned at the thin evidence against her and the history of complaints against Briggs. Something in his chest stirred. He had commanded many soldiers, but stories like hers were rare. He whispered to himself, "This does not smell of justice. It smells of fear." Harlan closed the file and stood tall. If a Marine who had bled for the flag could be crushed by lies, then what did that say about the corps he loved? That evening, he called for a car and set out toward the very courthouse where Naomi stood fighting for her honor. Back in the courtroom, Naomi did not yet know a general was on the road to her defense. All she knew was that the prosecutor was pressing harder each hour, trying to paint her as unstable. On the stand, Briggs acted like a wounded hero, holding up his bandaged hand for the jury to see. He spoke about respect for the chain of command and claimed Naomi had spit in the face of order. Dana objected, but the judge allowed most of his testimony. The jury shifted uneasily. Naomi clenched her fists, wanting to scream, but instead she forced herself to breathe slow. Then a surprise twist came when a waitress from the diner named Clara stepped forward from the crowd. She had been too afraid before, but now she raised her hand to testify. Clara said, "I was there. She never hit him." He leaned over her table, insulted her, and when she answered with dignity, he grew red with anger. "That is the truth." The courtroom erupted with murmurs. Briggs's face twisted in rage. The judge struck his gavel, but the seed of doubt had bloomed larger. Naomi felt tears sting her eyes, not from weakness, but from the relief that someone had finally chosen courage over fear. The courthouse was packed tighter than ever on the day General Harlan arrived. No one had expected a man of his rank to walk through those wooden doors. His presence was electric. Reporters whispered frantically. Soldiers in uniform stood straighter. Even Judge Whitmore adjusted his robe nervously. Harlan wore his full dress uniform, and the rows of ribbons on his chest glowed under the lights. He did not take a seat in the back. Instead, he walked directly to the front row and sat where Naomi could see him. Her eyes widened with shock and her heart pounded. She had never met him, but every Marine knew his name. Dana leaned close and whispered, "This changes everything." The prosecutor tried to continue as if nothing had happened, but the jury could not ignore the weight of a general's silent gaze. Naomi felt strength rush back into her bones. For the first time since her arrest, she felt like she was not abandoned. She was still a Marine, and the corps had not fully turned its back. Harlan folded his arms across his chest and listened with sharp eyes, as if measuring every word for truth. His very presence shifted the balance of the room. When the session ended for lunch, the crowd spilled into the hall, buzzing with questions. Reporters chased after Heron, but he gave no answers. Instead, he walked directly to Naomi's parents, who stood quietly near the corner. He shook Samuel's hand firmly and said, "Your daughter is a Marine of honor. I know her record, and I will not let her name be buried under lies." Ruth's eyes filled with tears, and she whispered, "Thank you, sir." Back inside the courtroom, Harlan finally stood when the judge returned. With the gavel still in hand, the judge raised an eyebrow as the general requested to speak. His deep voice filled the chamber. "I am General Marcus Harlan, commander of thousands of Marines. I am here not to interfere, but to remind this court that honor is the spine of our corps. And I will tell you, Sergeant Naomi Carter has more honor in her smallest act than some men carry in their entire careers. Gasps echoed across the room. The prosecutor objected, but the judge hesitated. The jury stared wide-eyed. Naomi's throat tightened with emotion. To have a general stand for her was more than she had ever dreamed. The storm had not passed, but the wind was now shifting in her favor. The next morning, the courthouse was bursting with people. Word had spread that a general had spoken in defense of a black Marine accused of assault. Some came out of curiosity. Others came because they felt history was stirring. Naomi walked in still in chains, but with her head high. General Harland nodded at her from the front row, and that single gesture gave her the courage of 10,000 voices. The prosecutor looked pale yet pressed on. He tried to dismiss Clara Ara's testimony as confused memory, but Dana rose with sharp fire in her words. She asked the judge to summon the police officer who had taken the initial statement from Briggs. A tall officer shuffled to the stand, and his nervous eyes gave him away before he spoke. Under questioning, he admitted Briggs had demanded the report saying Naomi struck him, even though he had not seen it himself. The room gasped. Dana pressed harder, and the officer broke sweating through his uniform. He said quietly, "I was told if I did not write it his way, my career would be over." The jury leaned back, stunned. Even the judge's face softened. The cracks in the wall of lies were no longer cracks. They were breaking wide open. Naomi felt tears well, but she held them back, whispering to herself, "Hold the line." But the fight was not over. Briggs leapt from his seat red with rage and shouted, "She is lying! They are all lying!" He pointed at Naomi, his hand shaking. The judge slammed the gavel, demanding order, but the scene was chaos. Dana remained calm. She stepped forward and said, "Lieutenant Briggs, would you be willing to swear on your service oath that everything you have said is true?" The courtroom fell silent. Everyone knew the weight of an oath for a soldier. Briggs hesitated, his face twisting. Then a voice boomed across the chamber. General Harland stood tall and declared, "I will swear for Sergeant Carter. I have read her record. I have spoken to her comrades. I will stake my honor on her truth." The jury erupted with whispers. The judge's gavel pounded, but the moment had already shifted. Briggs collapsed back into his chair, muttering curses while Naomi's heart pounded. To hear a general swear for her was like hearing the flag itself finally speak her name. The storm of lies was breaking apart, but the final verdict still hung like thunder waiting to strike. The jury filed out to deliberate, and the air in the courtroom felt heavy as stone. Naomi sat at the defense table, her hands still bound, yet her spirit no longer chained. She thought of the little girls who might one day hear her story. She thought of her grandfather's porch, where she first learned the meaning of courage. Hours passed like years. Reporters whispered in the hall. Her parents sat together in silent prayer. General Harland remained seated, his eyes steady on Naomi as if guarding her with his presence. At last the doors opened and the jury returned. The foreman stood with a folded paper in his hand. Everyone rose. The judge asked for the verdict. Naomi's heart hammered so loud she thought it would break her chest. The foreman's voice shook, but his words rang clear. "Not guilty." For a breath, the room was frozen. Then gasps and cries burst like thunder. Ruth clutched Samuel's hand with tears streaming. Dana hugged Naomi tight, whispering, "You are free." Naomi closed her eyes, whispering, "Thank you, Lord." The chains were unlocked and fell from her wrists with a heavy clink that echoed like freedom itself. She rubbed her raw skin and lifted her head high. She was still standing, but the story did not end with freedom alone. As Naomi turned toward her parents, General Harland rose from his seat. The courtroom hushed as he stepped forward. He stood in front of her, his tall frame casting a long shadow. Yet his eyes were warm. Slowly, he lifted his right hand to his brow and gave her a full salute. The crowd gasped. A general saluting a sergeant in open court was unheard of. Naomi's knees trembled, but she lifted her hand and returned the salute with tears streaming down her cheeks. Harland's voice carried across the chamber. "Sergeant Carter, you carried the flag with honor, even when the flag did not carry you. Today, it carries you again." The rumor erupted into applause, some people standing with hands over hearts. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing history had been made. Naomi's parents wept openly. Dana wiped her eyes. Naomi lowered her hand and whispered, "Thank you, sir." In that moment, she felt years of pain lift from her shoulders. The salute was not just for her. It was for every soldier of color who had been overlooked, erased, or doubted. It was for her grandfather, her father, and for every child watching who would now know courage could not be silenced. When Naomi walked out of the courthouse that day, the sky seemed brighter than it had in months. Reporters swarmed with cameras flashing, but she did not speak of anger or revenge. Instead, she lifted her chin and said, "Only this, I stood for truth, and I will keep standing." Her words spread across the nation, carried by news channels and whispered in homes. Some saw her as a hero, some still doubted her. But what mattered most was the young girl in Georgia who turned on the TV and saw a black Marine walk free with honor. That child whispered to her mother, "Maybe I can be brave, too." Naomi returned to her unit, where many of her Marines met her with tears and open arms. James Miller came forward, shame on his face. He stammered an apology, but Naomi only said, "Do better next time." Then she walked past him, refusing to let bitterness root in her soul. General Harland later wrote a letter to Congress demanding reforms to protect soldiers from false charges born of prejudice. The letter carried Naomi's name as proof that courage could outlast hate. At home, Ruth hugged her daughter so tight she could hardly breathe. And Samuel whispered, "You have turned your wounds into weapons of light." Naomi smiled, knowing her battle was not the last, but also knowing she had left a mark that could not be erased. She had faced racism in its cruelest form, yet walked through with her honor unbroken. In the end, it was not the verdict or even the salute that defined her story. It was the truth that no matter how heavy the chains of hate may be, they cannot hold down a soul built for freedom. And so, the story of Sergeant Naomi Carter does not end in that courtroom. It continues every time we think about what it truly means to wear the uniform of this country. It continues every time we remember that justice is not given freely, but must often be fought for with courage and patience. Naomi stood in chains, yet carried herself with more honor than those who tried to break her. She faced lies meant to bury her, yet she rose higher because her truth could not be silenced. And when a general lifted his hand to salute her, it was more than one soldier honoring another. It was history bending toward justice. It was a moment that told every person watching that dignity cannot be erased and courage cannot be bought. It was a moment that told every child of color that their voice matters and their truth has power. Naomi's story reminds us that racism still lives in the corners of our nation, but it also reminds us that light is stronger than darkness. It reminds us that when one person chooses to speak up, others find the courage to step forward too. Clara the waitress could have stayed silent, but she chose truth. The officer could have kept lying, but he chose honesty. And the general could have stayed in Washington, but he chose to stand with honor in that courtroom. These choices may seem small, but they changed everything. That is the lesson for us. Every choice we make to stand for justice, to speak the truth, to honor dignity instead of hate becomes part of a chain of courage that grows stronger with every link. If you were moved by Naomi's story today, do not let it stop with just watching. Be the next link in that chain. Stand tall when you see injustice, speak up when you hear lies, and never forget that one voice spoken with courage can shake an entire room, an entire system, an entire world. Naomi Carter was just one woman, yet she carried the weight of her ancestors, the prayers of her parents, and the hope of a generation. You carry that same power inside you. Do not bury it. Do not let fear steal it. Use it. Now, if this story touched your heart, if it made you think deeper about justice, if it inspired you to believe again in the power of truth, then I ask you to join us. Like this video so more people can see it. Share it with your friends and family so the message spreads beyond just this screen. Comment below with your thoughts, your feelings, your own stories of courage and justice because your words matter too. They are part of the larger story being written right now. And of course, subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story like this one. Every week we bring you tales that stir the heart, challenge the mind, and remind us that miracles are real. By subscribing, you are not just following a channel. You are becoming part of a community that believes in hope, that believes in dignity, that believes in standing strong even when the world tries to push us down. So let this story stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Remember Naomi Carter whenever you face a moment where silence seems easier. Remember that silence protects the liar, but courage lifts the truth. Remember that honor is not given by medals or ranks or uniforms. Honor is chosen every day by the way we treat each other. And remember that even in a courtroom full of lies, one act of bravery, one act of honesty, one salute can turn the tide. We thank you for spending this time with us today. We thank you for opening your heart to Naomi's journey. And we ask you to carry this message forward because somewhere out there right now, another person is sitting in their own courtroom of life, feeling alone, feeling chained, feeling forgotten. Maybe your voice, your stand, your encouragement will be the salute they need to keep going. Be that light, be that strength, be that hope. So, one last time before we go, if you believe in justice, if you believe in honor, if you believe in the unbreakable power of truth, then please like this video, share it far and wide. Comment with your thoughts and subscribe to join this family of hope. Together, we can make sure stories like Naomi's are never forgotten and that courage always finds a voice. This is more than just entertainment. This is a mission to remind the world that the human spirit cannot be chained. That love is stronger than hate. That truth is stronger than lies. And that honor can rise from the darkest storms. Thank you for being here. Thank you for standing with us. And thank you for believing with us that no matter how heavy the chains of hate may be, they can never hold down a soul built for freedom.